So when we talk about mission creep, that's certainly part of the economics of bureaucracy. And one thing about foreign intervention of really any flavor, whether we're talking about humanitarian aid or we're talking about war, it's all done in this bureaucratic regime, so overlapping layers of bureaucracy. Bureaucratic firms don't compete for profit like a standard firm would. So the way I typically explain it, if you have a for-profit firm, they look at their financial statements at the end of the quarter, they're earning a profit. That's indicating to them that they are providing something that is adding value to society. A negative profit or a loss indicates the opposite. Bureaucracies, however, they're not competing for profit or loss. They are competing for government resources, so pieces of some larger budget. How do they convey that they should get a bigger piece of that budget, that they should have more personnel? By taking on more and more activities which are important to the powers that be.
Yeah, so just to be clear, they're competing for this budget, so they have to spend money even in cases where they wouldn't have a good reason to. Is that fair to say?
Absolutely. There's no incentive to cost minimize.
Right.
If you are...
There's a decentive, right? I mean, there's reasons not to do it.
Oh, and
because
absolutely.
then your budget will be cut.
Right.
Yeah.
If I'm a government agency and I go to you as the federal government and I say, hey, I can do the exact same job that I'm doing with 20% less money, the next year I'm going to have 20% less in my budget, which is not what you are incentivized to do. As somebody operating a bureaucracy. Now, this doesn't mean that the people who are working in the government are necessarily, terrible people who are sitting there wringing their hands trying to get as much money as possible. But as an economist, we look at that and we say, well, this is the incentive structure that they face.
So how did that system get built? I mean, how did this come to be? I'm not an economist, but it sounds quite ridiculous. I would want something that was slim and trim and took as little from the people as possible, and that could, every year become more efficient and need less resources and all that. And that's quite literally the reverse of what we have.
One thing about this bureaucratic system is that there is that incentive to expand. Not saying that it's not possible to constrain it, but there's actually an entire branch of economics called constitutional political economy, which is trying to answer the question of if we want something like a government who will provide quote unquote national defense or roads or education, whatever you want to put in that bucket, how do we construct a political system where we can empower our leaders to do the things that we want them to do, and yet simultaneously constrain them to not go outside of those stated confines that we would prefer, or those functions that we want them to fulfill. In terms of how we got there, it's a tricky question. It requires a lot of historical knowledge. My experience has been looking at how things have evolved militarily, particularly that military-industrial complex, because we've always seen a relationship between private actors and public actors. That's nothing that's new. However, this massive kind of military spending that we have right now is not something that has always been observed in the US. And that really starts, I think, if you want to pinpoint it, during the interwar years between World War I and World War II, because you've got contracting rules that change. So it used to be if I had an idea for something that the military could use, I would pitch that idea to various boards. They would look at it. They would look to see if it was a good idea. They'd send out bids. But now, and this kind of started during that period, the rules of the game have changed for those kinds of contracts. So instead of who can build something the cheapest, it might be, we have a relationship with this particular company, or they're familiar with our processes. And so it's built up over time.
Do you think there's any kind of functional way to roll back some of that? I mean, if you wanted to get the system, if you wanted to have a fair bidding process or something that was going to be a little more fiscally responsible or any of that, is it possible to roll back things that are inside of such a massive complex as you're mentioning?
I would like to say that I think anything is possible. I'm not sure that I think it's particularly likely. You have massive entrenched interest. You look at something like drones or tanks. There have been tanks, for example, that the military has said for years, we do not want them. And yet they continue to be manufactured, and they are quite literally sitting in a compound somewhere, and they are just rusting. why are we still manufacturing these? It's because the places where they're manufactured, they're elected officials, keenly aware of the fact that if they shut down these factories, some of their constituency is going to be unemployed. That does not bode well for their reelection.
Yeah.
They fight really hard to keep those things in place. And so you're fighting those battles at so many different junctures. I'm honestly not really sure what it would take.
Yeah. How could you even start to fight that at the political level? Because you'd have to have a politician who'd be willing to say to his own people, you're going to lose some jobs because unfortunately in this case, it's the right thing to do.
Right. And
we don't get many politicians like that, do we?
No. And there's actually a famous economist named F.A. Hayek, who in chapter 10 of his book, The Road to Serfdom, talks about why the worst get on top. So why it is that you are unlikely to have those kinds of political officials get into place. Because the people who are going to seek out those positions and people who are going to, importantly, be successful in those positions are not to the people who are going to say, let's take one for the team and roll back these policies. People like to think, and economists make this mistake as well, that political officials are publicly interested. So they set aside their own incentives, their own desires, and instead they're trying to fulfill some broader notion of the public good. So they've set it up oftentimes what's called a social welfare function. So you put societal welfare on one side of the equal sign, and if you just have all of your math correct on the other side, you can make people as happy as possible. But this really ignores things that you learn on quite literally day one of your economics classes. That people respond to incentives. So political actors, just like any other actor facing scarcity, we should expect that they're going to respond to incentives as well.